There are nights when dreams refuse to stay inside our heads. They slip into reality, leaving behind traces we can't explain and memories we can't erase. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true stories where nightmares didn't end with waking, they began there. Each tale unravels like a confession, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we almost believe we imagined. Watch closely, listen carefully, and decide for yourself what was dream and what was real. If these stories send a chill down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Story 1, the basement room. When I think back to those nights, I can still feel the chill that came with them. For years, I had a dream that repeated itself with almost surgical precision. It wasn't every night, not even every week, but it came back often enough that I couldn't write it off as random. Each time it began the same way. In the dream, I found myself standing at the top of a narrow staircase. The air was thick, damp, and colder than it should have been. The stairs seemed to sink into the earth, spiraling down into a place my body didn't want to go. But my feet moved anyway. Every creak of the wooden steps echoed, almost as if the house itself was listening. At the bottom was a rusted metal door, the kind you'd expect to see in an abandoned factory, not a suburban home. Its surface was stained with time, streaks of brown and black running like dried blood. And then came the sound. It always started faint, almost like the scratching of a rat. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't random noise. It was deliberate. A sharp, metallic clawing, nails or fingers dragging across steel, again and again, like something on the other side was desperate to be let out. That was always the moment I woke up, sweat sticking to my skin, breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering as though it wanted to escape before I could. At first, I brushed it off. Kids have nightmares, and I figured that's all it was. But the problem with this dream was how stubborn it became. Months passed, then years, and still it returned, always the same staircase, the same iron door, the same dreadful scraping. And every time I woke, there was this uneasy sense that it hadn't really ended. Because in the mornings, when the sun had already climbed above the rooftops, I would hear it again. Not in the dream this time, from the real basement. A low, muffled thud, or the faint scrape of something shifting against the concrete floor below. I told myself it had to be the pipes, maybe an old furnace groaning in its sleep. But deep down, I knew better. I tried checking once or twice. The basement was empty. Of course. Just stacks of cardboard boxes, a washer that rattled whenever it ran, and the constant smell of damp wood. That smell was the worst part. It wasn't just musty, it carried the weight of decay, like the earth itself was rotting beneath the foundation. I could never stay long. Each time I went down, a pressure would build in my chest, urging me to leave before something happened that I couldn't explain away. And yet, the dream never let me go. Think about it for a sec. How many nightmares have you had in your life that follow a script so exact you could recite it step by step, They say dreams are just the brain's way of sorting through chaos, stitching random memories together. But there was nothing random about mine. It was a story, a routine, almost a ritual. Each detail fixed in place, as though whatever waited behind that rusted door wanted me to keep coming back until I finally understood. Some people might laugh and say, I was just overthinking it. But when you wake up night after night with the same sound ringing in your ears, only to hear its echo in your own house the next morning, you start to wonder, was it really just a dream? Or was I being shown something I wasn't ready to face? That thought haunted me more than the dream itself. Because if it wasn't only in my head, then whatever was clawing at that door wasn't going to stay behind it forever. It wasn't until much later that I started asking questions outside of my own family. You see, I had grown tired of pretending that these dreams were just a trick of my imagination. Something about them felt rooted in reality, as if the house itself carried a memory it wanted me to inherit. So one afternoon, almost without thinking, I brought it up with one of the neighbors, an older man who had lived on the street for decades. The look he gave me when I mentioned the basement told me more than his words ever could. His face tightened, his eyes shifted, as though I had dug up a subject that had been carefully buried. After a long pause, he finally admitted that the basement in my house had been sealed for many years before my parents moved in. Not because of plumbing issues or repairs, but because of something darker. According to him, a tenant had once rented a room in our home back when it belonged to a different family. He was a quiet man, barely spoken of. But one night he simply vanished. No note, no goodbye, no trace of where he had gone. The last place anyone saw him was near the basement. The police searched, of course, but nothing came of it. And eventually, like so many unsolved mysteries, it faded from memory. The family who owned the house sealed the basement door and moved away, perhaps to escape the whispers. Hearing this made my skin crawl. It explained too much and not enough at the same time. Could the dreams have been fragments of a story the house was trying to tell me? Could the scraping behind that rusted door have been the echo of a man who never left? Logic wanted to dismiss it, but the deeper part of me knew that logic had no business in places like this. Still, knowing the story gave the dreams a new edge. They weren't just nightmares anymore. They were reenactments of something that had once been real. And that thought stayed with me, circling my mind like a vulture, until the night everything came to a head. It was close to midnight when the dream returned, more vivid than ever. The staircase groaned under my weight. The air pressed against my chest like a heavy hand, and the scraping at the door was louder, angrier. But this time, I didn't wake up in bed like before. I woke to the sound, still ringing in my ears only now. I was fully awake. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the noise came again. Clear. Distinct. Metal against metal. And it was coming from the real basement. I froze, every nerve in my body urging me to stay put. But curiosity has a way of overpowering fear, especially when you've spent years haunted by the same unanswered question. So I crept down the stairs, one hand on the wall for balance, with the other gripping the railing so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The basement air was colder than usual, sharp, with that same moldy scent that never seemed to fade. And there it was, the door. Only now, it wasn't shut the way it always had been. It was ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. I wanted to tell myself the house had shifted, that the frame had loosened. But that lie fell apart the moment I saw the surface of the metal. Fresh scratches streaked across it. Long, jagged lines, etched deep as if something or some had been clawing from the inside, desperate to break through. My breath caught, and for a moment, the world went silent except for the pounding of my own heart. It wasn't a dream anymore. It had crossed over, seeping into the fabric of the house, into my life. And standing there, staring at that half-open door, I realized the thing I feared most was no longer the dream itself. It was the possibility that the man who vanished had never really left, that he had been waiting all this time, just beyond the rusted door. Story 2, The Woman in the Field. I never thought going back to my hometown would leave me with memories I still struggle to make sense of. It was supposed to be simple, a few quiet days in the countryside, away from the noise of the city. But almost as soon as I arrived, the dreams began. They always started the same way. I would find myself standing in the middle of an open field. No trees, no fences, just endless grass swaying in the night breeze. The horizon stretched into blackness, yet I was never alone. A woman was there. She wore a long white dress that shimmered faintly, like the moonlight clung to her. She never moved toward me, never raised her voice, but somehow I always heard her. She called my name with a softness that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't a scream or a pleat, it was a quiet beckoning, almost like she had been waiting for me. But the strangest part was her face. No matter how hard I tried, I could never see it clearly. Sometimes it blurred. Other times it shifted like smoke. A figure with no identity, yet one that felt deeply personal, as if I was supposed to recognize her. Each time I woke from the dream, the sound of her voice clung to me like an echo that refused to die. At first, I told myself it was just the countryside atmosphere messing with my mind. Old places have a way of stirring old fears. But what unsettled me most was what began happening after I woke. The first time, I thought nothing of it. I rolled out of bed, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and went to put on my shoes. That's when I noticed mud caked along the soles, damp earth pressed deep into the grooves. I froze. The night before, I hadn't stepped outside once. The doors were locked, the windows closed. Yet there it was, proof that my feet had touched the ground beyond the house. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had gone out half asleep. Maybe I had carried something in by accident. But the pattern continued. Every time I had the dream, the mud returned. Sometimes thick and wet, sometimes only a trace, but always there, always fresh. And then came the night that truly broke me. I was sharing a room with a friend from town who agreed to stay over. We joked about my strange dreams, and he promised to keep an ear open while I slept. That night, as always, I dreamed of the woman in white. She called to me, her voice more insistent, closer than before. I remember answering her in the dream, asking what she wanted, though the words barely left my mouth. When I woke, my friend was sitting upright in bed, pale as a ghost. He told me he had heard me speaking in my sleep, my voice low but clear, as though I wasn't talking to myself. I was answering someone, not babbling, not muttering answering. He said he could hear the pauses, as if another voice, one he couldn't hear, was filling the silence between my words. That was the moment I stopped treating it as coincidence. The mud could have been explained, the recurring dreams dismissed. But hearing from another person that I was carrying on a conversation that was different, it suggested something beyond imagination, something that crossed the fragile line between dream and reality. The question that haunted me from then on wasn't why the woman called me, but what would happen if I finally answered her properly. The more I thought about the dreams, the more restless I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just accidents of the mind. So I started asking questions, casually at first, slipping the topic into conversations with people who had lived there longer than me. Most shrugged it off. But one evening, an old neighbor finally gave me an answer I didn't expect. She lowered her voice, as though even speaking of it might invite something unwanted. She told me that years ago, long before I was born, a woman from the village had taken her own life in the very fields I now dreamed about. Her story was grim, betrayed by her husband, abandoned in disgrace. She walked out into the open night wearing a white dress and never came back. They found her body at dawn, swaying gently from a tree at the edge of the field. The image was said to be so haunting that people avoided that place for years. But time has a way of erasing scars. Crops grew, seasons changed, and the story became little more than a whisper among the elders. Still, there was one detail that refused to fade. They said that on quiet nights, anyone walking past the fields could hear her, a voice carried by the wind, calling out names. Not always the same name, not always the name of someone present, but clear enough to freeze the blood of anyone who listened. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others swore it was real. I wanted to believe it was just folklore, a tragic tale embroidered over decades into something larger than life. Yet the way my neighbor's hands trembled as she spoke, the way her eyes avoided mine, told me she believed every word. And as much as I wanted to laugh it off, I couldn't, because her description matched my dreams too perfectly. The white dress, the calling voice, the presence that demanded recognition. From then on, I carried a dread that grew heavier with each passing night. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they sharpened. The voice became clearer, the figure closer. Each time I woke, the mud on my shoes seemed fresher, wetter, as though the distance between dream and reality was collapsing. Then came my last night in the countryside. I remember lying in bed, exhausted, but unable to shake the tension clawing at my chest. When I finally drifted off, the dream returned with a vengeance. The woman stood closer than ever, her voice no longer soft but insistent, almost pleading. She stretched out a hand, and for the first time, I felt the urge to step toward her. That was when I snapped awake. My heart was racing, my throat dry. At first, I thought I had escaped the dream as I always did. But then I noticed something wrong. The air in the room was cold, colder than it should have been. The curtains shifted slightly, and that's when I saw it, the front door, wide open, swinging gently as if it had been pushed by an unseen hand. I forced myself up and stumbled to the window. My stomach dropped. The ground outside, damp from a passing rain, was marked with footprints. Small, narrow, unmistakably a woman's. They glistened in the moonlight, each one pressed deep into the soil, trailing away from the house. I followed them with my eyes, every step pulling me further into dread. The path didn't wander or fade. It led straight out into the open field, disappearing into the darkness where the grass whispered in the night breeze. And in that silence, I could have sworn I heard her again, soft at first, then rising, her voice threading through the air like it had in my dreams. She was still calling my name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had. Story 3. The Mirror. I've heard people say that old furniture carries memories, that objects absorb the lives of those who once owned them. I never put much weight into that idea until I brought a second-hand mirror into my apartment. It looked ordinary enough, framed in dark wood, a little scratched from age, but nothing unusual. I bought it cheap at a flea market, thinking it might add some character to the bare walls of my room. The first few nights were uneventful. I hardly paid attention to it. But then the dreams began. In them, I was always standing in front of the mirror. The room behind me looked the same, every detail in place. At first, the reflection followed my movements, just slightly off. A blink a little late, a tilt of the head that dragged behind mine, almost as if the reflection was hesitant. Half a beat slower. It was strange enough to make me uneasy, but not terrifying, at least. Not yet. But as the dreams repeated, the hesitation grew. The reflection no longer lagged. It stopped. While I moved, it stood still, eyes fixed directly on me. Not glassy, not lifeless watching, like a person on the other side of a window, studying me carefully, waiting for me to notice that something was wrong. That's when I started waking in the middle of the night, sweating, with the mirror looming in the corner. I began covering it with a sheet before going to bed, telling myself it was silly but necessary. Yet even then, the dreams didn't stop. The reflection pierced through whatever barrier I tried to put up, and I woke each morning with the sense that I was being observed long after I opened my eyes. I could have kept all of this to myself, but I wasn't the only one noticing. Friends who visited made comments I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, a buddy of mine laughed nervously and said, "Your reflection looks off. Like it's you, but it's not you." I brushed it off, joked that maybe the mirror was warped, but his face told me he wasn't laughing. The tension grew worse when my roommate finally spoke up. It was late, and I was asleep, dead, tired from a long day. The next morning, he looked pale, unsettled. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated before telling me. He said he'd woken up in the night, glanced across the room, and saw the mirror. What chilled him wasn't meat, was the reflection. According to him, while I slept with my eyes closed, my reflection in the mirror hadn't closed its eyes at all. It was staring outward, wide awake, unblinking, as though it was aware of everything in the room, even while I dreamed. Hearing that made my blood run cold. It meant the unease wasn't just in my head anymore. Someone else had witnessed it. The reflection was no longer confined to my imagination, it was manifesting, showing itself to others. Think about that for a second. A warped frame or poor lighting might distort an image, but no distortion could ever explain a reflection that moved on its own, or one that refused to sleep when I did. It was behaving independently, as though whatever lived inside that mirror wasn't me at all, but something using my likeness to disguise itself. From then on, the mirror was no longer just a decoration. It was a presence that had entered my life quietly, innocently, but now refused to leave. And the more attention I gave it, the more it seemed to want. By this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The dreams, my friend's reaction, my roommate's story, all painted a picture I didn't want to see. So, I did what anyone desperate for answers would do. I went back to the cellar. The man who ran the stall at the flea market was older, the kind of person who seemed used to questions, but rarely gave straight answers. When I asked about the mirror, his expression shifted. He wasn't surprised. Not exactly, but cautious, as though he'd been waiting for someone to come back and ask. After a long silence, he told me the truth. The mirror hadn't come from an estate sale or a private home, as he'd first claimed. It had been removed from an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The building had been closed for decades, falling apart brick by brick. But certain pieces of furniture had been salvaged and sold off. My mirror, he said, had once hung in a patient's room. When I pressed for details, he hesitated again, then finally lowered his voice. There had been a patienta young woman who had taken her life inside that very room. The mirror, he admitted, was the only thing left untouched afterward. Staff avoided it, but no one dared destroy it, for reasons he didn't explain. It simply stayed there until the building was gutted. Hearing that sent a chill through me. It gave form to everything I had been experiencing. Suddenly, the reflection's independence, the way it seemed to observe me, made a terrible kind of sense. If an object could hold on to trauma, if it could absorb the last moments of a person's life, then maybe this mirror was more than just glass. Maybe it was a doorway, or worse, a prison. I tried convincing myself it was just a story meant to scare off curious buyers. But the nights that followed proved otherwise. One dream in particular still burns in my memory. I was standing before the mirror again, as I always did. Only this time, the reflection no longer mirrored me at all. It moved with intent. Its eyes narrowed. Its mouth twisted into something I can only describe as hunger. And before I could react, its hand shot further through the glass, through the boundary that should have kept us apart, and grabbed me by the wrists. The sensation was horrifyingly real. Cold fingers. Firm grip. Pulling with a strength that made my chest tighten in panic. I struggled. But the harder I fought, the deeper I sank. My body pressed against the surface of the mirror like it had turned to liquid. I remember screaming, yet no sound left my mouth. The last thing I saw before waking was my own terrified face vanishing into the reflection. I woke with a jolt, gasping, drenched in sweat. My wrists ached as though they'd truly been gripped. For a long moment, I sat frozen in bed, afraid to look at the mirror across the room. But eventually I forced myself to glance at it. That's when I saw it. A handprint, pressed against the inside of the glass. Not a smudge. Not dust clear. Defined. And unmistakably human. I rushed over, heart pounding, and tried wiping it away. Cloth. Water. Even scraping at it with my nail set didn't matter. The mark was embedded in the glass, as though someone had reached out from the other side and left proof of their presence. I still don't know what the mirror wants, or what it's capable of. All I know is that since that night, I can't bring myself to throw it away. Maybe part of me fears what will happen if I try. Maybe part of me already believes it isn't the mirror that's trapped but me.